It doesn't matter how long you've played video games, there's always something you're gonna screw up, especially when you're diving face first into a new release. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 mistakes every gamer makes when you start a new game. And number 10, pressing the wrong buttons. It can be tough to learn the controls to a new game, especially when the game has like a complicated or novel control scheme. These days, it seems like most developers try to stick to the controls people expect, so if you're playing an FPS, it's probably going to control a lot like Call of Duty, maybe like Doom. But there's usually at least one or two things that are different, and that's where the problem comes in. A really specific example here is games that switch out the reloading controls. For most games, it's the bumper or it's X, but I always seem to press the wrong button when they change it to something like B in Red Dead Redemption. I mean, if there's any game where you're going to make a mistake or two, it's Red Dead 2. The game has a ridiculously complicated control scheme and allows you to perform a wide variety of actions, but it takes a lot of practice before you can really get your head around it, and until that happens, you're going to mess up. The biggest problems all seem to come from targeting. At first, focusing on things always puts me on edge because of both how you aim your gun and how you interact with other characters. Like you press it at the wrong time, it can lead to problems. But sometimes you're going to do something that's straight up dumb, like punch your horse by mistake or something. And it's not something that happens one time, it's going to keep happening until you get accustomed to the controls. Depending on who you are, that may be 2 hours, that may be 20 hours, but either way, there's going to be mistakes when you start a new game. At number 9, immediately go in the most dangerous direction and die. This is a potential problem in pretty much any game that lets you go where you want from the start. They don't tell you where to go, so you pick a direction and oops, that was the wrong way. Instead of going on the intended path filled with relatively easy early game enemies, the place is filled with brutal monsters that can destroy you in a single hit. The most obvious recent example of this kind of thing is Caelid from Elden Ring. The game starts you off in Limgrave, the first region, but there's nothing stopping you from heading east into this miserable poison swamp filled with gigantic monsters that'll tear your starting character to shreds. Previous From games aren't exactly better. The original Dark Souls wasn't even an open world game, and you could still go the wrong way from the start. The hub world, of course, is the reason this could happen. But out of the 3 possible directions you could travel from the Firelink Shrine, 2 of them were basically instant death for a starting character. The catacombs are guarded by powerful skeletons that constantly come back to life if you don't kill them with a holy weapon, while the new Londo ruins are filled with murderous ghosts that you can't even damage without a special item. Starting out, both these places equal instant death, and going right to them from the beginning of the game is one of the easiest mistakes you can make, starting it up for the first time. At number 8, it's forgetting to save or just not knowing when a game doesn't autosave. This is probably one of the most annoying new game mistakes out there. It really sucks to have to redo a ton of progress, especially these days where it's assumed there's going to be some kind of autosave function. For as bad as Souls games can be about letting you go in a direction you really shouldn't, they always save your progress no matter what, so you're rarely just wasting time if you die, because they know you're going to die. Compare that to something like the classic GTA games, like 3, Vice City, and San Andreas, where there's pretty much no auto-saving. If you don't manually save and then die in a mission, if you decide to reload, you'll just lose all that progress up to that point. Okay, normally you don't lose everything if you die, you lose just body armor and weapons if you get busted, but it's usually easier and faster to just reset the game at that point. But if you don't save, that's potentially hours of progress lost. Now, this isn't a game most people are just going to be playing for fun these days, but one of the most infamous games with this kind of issue is Sonic 06. It's a problem pretty much everybody who plays that game has. They start the first mission, run out of lives, and find out they have to play the entire game over again from the start. The game doesn't auto-save until after you beat a mission, so that means you have to go through all the boring tutorials and cutscenes again. And the stuff that isn't cutscenes and tutorials in Sonic 06 is excruciating. You can only imagine how bad those things are. Mass Effect 1 was also a game that was really stingy with autosaves. These days, you never know if a game has all autosaves, manual saving, or something in between, so even though games are better in general about making it so you don't lose your progress, it's still a thing that happens, and it always sucks to have to replay a big chunk of the game just because you didn't realize you were supposed to save. And number 7, wanting to open the map, but you open the menu instead. Like, you know exactly what I'm talking about here, right? One of the most important things to do in an open world game is to open the map. You're constantly checking your position and putting down waypoints. For a lot of open world games, you're also opening the menu a lot, either to sort through your inventory or level up your character. With both buttons being basically interchangeable in games, combined with how often you have to access either menu, always seems to create problems. Compared to other entries so far, this one probably feels like a minor annoyance annoyance rather than a big problem, but it's something everybody does, and it always seems to take too long to adjust to. It seems like every time I start a new game, I'm always pressing the wrong menu button. If I want to look at the map, I go to the inventory by mistake, or if I want to equip a new weapon, I open up the map instead. It's only like a second of lost time, but it's never not annoying. It's one of the most minor problems in gaming. At the end of the day, it's not really an issue at all, but having to constantly switch menus gets really old after a while, especially when you're way past the point of being new with a game. And number 6, when you don't realize you can do some very basic function of the game. Like, games these days can be very complicated, and even if you're careful about reading all the tooltips and tutorials, there's a lot that you could potentially forget. It's something that's going to happen, even to gaming veterans, and it sucks when you overlook something or just don't internalize some essential piece of information and end up playing through the entire start of the game without realizing you can do something that's really important to your progression. Now, I'm being kind of vague in terms of how I describe this, because I've seen Fallout 4 players not realize that perks exist, or the Dragon Claws show the solution to temple puzzles in Skyrim. Just basic stuff that seems obvious to people who already know about it, but it's also stuff that you can easily forget about. Even more complicated games can lead to bigger oversights, like not realizing you can hold a weapon in 2 hands in a Souls game, or like not realizing you can double jump in Mario 64 or something. Now, here's an old school example. In Super Metroid, a lot of people didn't realize there was a run button. So when they got to this one room that requires you to run, or you'll fall through the floor, you just get stuck. In fact, I very, very specifically remember that happening when I was a kid. It's basic stuff like this that sometimes gets missed by players, and even though these mistakes might sound ridiculous to you now, missing something obvious is definitely a thing we've done, at least at some point in our lives. And number 5 is endlessly restarting the game. This applies more to a specific type of game, but if you're into Western RPGs and strategy games, you know what I'm talking about. Like, certain games throw a lot of options at you from the beginning and kind of just expect you to go along with it. They give you a lot of stats to allocate, characters to build, even empires to set up. Like, there's a lot of options to make yourself stronger, but just as many that could be seen as a beginner's trap. In some games, the only way to make a truly optimal start is to either look up strategies online or trial and error your way through the start. So for some games, restarting is practically essential. I know a lot of people who had to restart XCOM 2, for example. It's kind of inevitable depending on the game you're playing, but there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. And just completely restarting a game over and over is not the best way to do it. In board games, there's a term called analysis paralysis, which describes when someone refuses to make a turn because they're trying to guess every possible outcome from every potential move. And when someone keeps restarting a game, they're kind of doing the single player version of that. They're letting the perfect become the enemy of the good, and with most Western RPGs, it's sort of expected that you don't make a perfectly optimized character. They want you to make a few mistakes, and they're usually forgiving enough that it's unnecessary to make the perfect starting character or civilization. You learn a lot more about what works and what doesn't by just playing the game anyway. Number 4 is screwing up the jump. Jumping as a game mechanic is so ubiquitous, but also completely different depending on the game. Like, you'll never really know what you're going to get when you're jumping into a new game, no pun intended, and it inevitably leads to mistakes. Some games have really floaty jump mechanics, some games are heavy, some let you grab ledges, some don't. It's kind of a free-for-all, and in the end, you'll die from a missed jump or two just trying to figure out what version of a jump a game has. This is one of those mistakes everyone makes that's perfectly understandable because it seems like every game is different. Jumping in Skyrim is nothing like jumping in GTA, which isn't even close to a jump in Super Mario Brothers. So if you're accustomed to one, you'll struggle with a game that switches it up. It's not as bad in games that don't require a lot of precision platforming, but there are a lot of games with weird jump controls that require absolute precision. In fact, having a very specific jump mechanic and a type of precision built around it is often a selling point for platforming games themselves. Like, I can't tell you how long it took for me to get used to jumping in Mirror's Edge, for example. You jump in that game by pressing L1, not X, L1. In the context of the game, it's fine, but it takes some getting used to, and there's some pretty messed up jumps along the way before you get into that game's groove. It's just one of those unavoidable little things that is, I don't know, annoying in a lot of games. There's going to be problems if there's jumping. And number 3, when you didn't read the manual. Now, tutorials, tooltips, and pop-ups can be pretty annoying. And I don't know about you, but when I start a game, I kind of just want to get playing. I don't want to really read a novel on game mechanics before starting things up. But depending on how complicated a game is, it's often a good idea to at least try to absorb some of the information a game throws at you. Way back when, this was mostly done by reading the game's manual. Before in-game tutorials, reading the manual is sometimes the only way to get essential information about a game. If you didn't read it, you would run into problems. These days, games tend to do a better job explaining themselves without some external piece of literature, but sometimes they throw so much at you in a relatively short amount of time, it can be disorienting and confusing. I don't know about you, but I always seem to have issues starting up a new Assassin's Creed. They throw so much at you right at the start, and it's overwhelming, so stuff kind of inevitably falls through the cracks. We're all gonna miss something in a game from time to time, like that's inevitable, but at a certain point, it's probably smart to check the tutorials again or crack open the in-game encyclopedia and just look at the controller layout and the options. Like doing even basic stuff like that can solve a lot of problems, but it's also possible to find people who just outright refuse to look at any of this stuff. A recent game called Tunic is actually all about this sort of thing. You have to access the in-game manual to solve a lot of its puzzles. Like if you don't read the manual for the game, you can't progress in it. And number 2, mashing buttons constantly. Like, this is super common in any action game, even Pokemon, where people just mash buttons to try to catch Pokemon faster. It doesn't work, but we do it anyway. It's probably one of the hardest habits to break. It's especially bad going from games that basically encourage button mashing to ones that punish it, by the way. It's one of those mistakes that I have to eventually figure out in almost every game I play. Starting out, you want to mash, and only with practice do you actually start to understand the layout and how to quickly glide through it. There's a lot of games where mashing buttons is a beginner's trap, like Devil May Cry or pretty much any fighting game. Like Souls games in particular, punishing about button mashing. It'll interrupt your dodge and drain your stamina needlessly. And pretty much all these kinds of games, button mashing is bad, but it's a hard habit to break, especially when you're just starting out. And number 1, missing something essential. Like there's few feelings worse than when you're playing a game, it just seems like you're doing something wrong. Like you understand how to play, it's not an issue of that, but something feels off, like something's missing. One of the absolute worst mistakes you can make playing a new game is when the game expects you to find something essential, but you miss it. Like the Cling Ring in Demon Souls, for instance. In Soul form, you lose 50% of your max health, which is a brutal punishment for dying. The ring, when equipped, halves the HP reduction, so you only lose 25% max health, which makes the game significantly easier when in soul form, but it's not an item they just give you. You have to find it. Now, it's not particularly hidden, but if you don't know where to look, it's easy to miss, and without this, an already challenging game becomes way tougher. Elden Ring has something similar. It's easy to miss the item used to summon spirit allies. If you never go back to the shrine near the start of the game, you basically miss out on the entire spirit summoning mechanic, which can make many of the game's bosses much more manageable. Those are only a few examples, but there's plenty more. Even with something as simple as fast travel in RDR2, that can make a big impact on how much fun you're having with the game. Couple of bonuses for you. Like sometimes you've run into a problem in a game that feels like it's your mistake, but it's one that pretty much everyone has problems with. Like the sea urchins you're supposed to push at the start of Link's Awakening, or those bizarre up and down barrels in Sonic 3's Carnival Night Zone. I remember when I was a kid and I had a limited amount of time to play games on weekdays, Carnival Night Zone and those stupid barrels messed me up. There's sections of games that every first-time player seems to struggle with, and for good reason. They're confusing or poorly explained. They're mistakes, but it's really the developers who should be blamed for creating them, not the players who are struggling with them. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.